Fortunately, much of the information that we're going to cover in the first part of this, you already know. We've already talked about synaptic transmission when we discussed the neuromuscular junction. With synaptic transmission, you are sending an action potential down an axon and transferring it from one neuron to another. Synapse is the junction between either two neurons or the neuron and effector when an action potential is transmitted. This is going to occur between the presynaptic neuron and the cell body or dendrite of the postsynaptic neuron. Some neurons will communicate via what are known as electrical synapses. So this part is new to you guys. These neurons are going to be coupled electrically through protein channels, gap junctions, and that allows for direct exchange of ions in between the cells. These are not as common as the chemical synapses. The gap junctions that connect the cytoplasms of those neighboring neurons are known as connections. And this is a very simple way of synchronizing the intercellular communication between those neighboring neurons. This is a classic picture, and you should recognize it right off the bat. You have the postsynaptic end bulb, you have the synaptic end bulb of a presynaptic neuron, where you have vesicles releasing a neurotransmitter into the synaptic cleft, which can also be called a synapse. That's kind of confusing. That neurotransmitter diffuses across the synaptic cleft and gets picked up by receptors on the postsynaptic membrane, triggering an action potential when you're talking about neurons. So we just went over this, but we're going to add a little bit more to the information that you already know. That action potential travels down the axon and reaches the synaptic end bulb of the presynaptic neuron. That will cause that synaptic end bulb to depolarize. That means calcium channels will open and calcium will rush in from the extracellular fluid. That is what is going to trigger the release of the neurotransmitter from the synaptic vesicles. Remember that the neurotransmitter is released via exocytosis. The neurotransmitter diffuses across the synaptic cleft, will get picked up by receptors on the postsynaptic neuron's membrane, which in turn will trigger another action potential in that postsynaptic neuron. You need to know about some of the neurotransmitters that we discuss. There are at least 30 that are going to be produced throughout the central nervous system. Some neurons are going to produce and secrete a single neurotransmitter. Other will produce and secrete numerous neurotransmitters. Most typically, the neurotransmitter you will see is acetylcholine. It is going to be released by all of our friends, the motor neurons, and it will also be produced and released by some neurons within the CNS. Other neurotransmitters are going to include this category, which are known as monoamines. That's a nice to know. They will be widely distributed throughout the brain, and they will help control your emotional behavior as well as your circadian rhythms. And there's a list of the ones that you need to know. Epinephrine, as soon as you hear epinephrine, think fight or flight. Think sympathetic nervous system. You will usually secrete this when you are angry or fearful The physiological responses that epinephrine will trigger include these: increased heart rate, increased respiration, pupil dilation, so more light comes into your eyes so you can see better, increased blood flow to skeletal muscle, decreased blood flow to your viscera, so you can fight or flee. If you have chronically elevated levels, you may be restless, you may be anxious, you might have sleep problems, or in acute situations, they will trigger the responses of acute stress. Norepinephrine is another excitatory neurotransmitter that is going to help you be attentive and focus. Dopamine can either be an excitatory neurotransmitter or an inhibitory neurotransmitter. It depends on the receptor to which it binds. It's going to play a number of roles and have a number of functions. It's going to play particularly important roles in the pathway for pleasures and rewards and addictions and thrills, or addictions to thrills. It also plays a role in memory formation and retention, and we know that it plays an important role in motor control. We have discussed dopamine relative to Parkinson's. When you talk about the role it plays with motor control, it is an inhibitory role. It will stop unwanted movements. In Parkinson's, you have insufficient dopamine, so you have excessive unwanted movements. Histamine is another excitatory neurotransmitter. It is going to play roles both in your sleep-wake cycles and in the inflammatory response. We talk more about that in the immune system in the next class. Serotonin is an inhibitory transmitter. These neurons, the neurons that produce and secrete this, have a large number of telodendria and are going to be very important in helping integrate your neural circuitry. A bunch of videos you can watch. I would watch at least one or two of those on Parkinson's, hint, hint. Now, we already know, at least in part, what happens to neurotransmitters after an action potential stops, because we talked about what happens to acetylcholine in the neuromuscular junction. There will be enzymes that are hanging out in the synaptic cleft which will destroy the neurotransmitter. Classically, acetylcholine esterase will destroy acetylcholine. Or the neurotransmitter may be pulled back into the presynaptic end bulb through a reuptake process. We need to talk briefly about neuropeptides, which are these protein-based molecules that are going to be synthesized within the CNS. They can either act as neurotransmitters themselves or will be what are known as neuromodulators, which will either change a neuron's response to a specific neurotransmitter or actually block the release of a neurotransmitter. Two important ones will be enkephalins and endorphins. For enkephalins, when you are undergoing painful stress, you will produce increased amounts of these guys. They actually bind to the same receptors that morphine binds to, and they will relieve pain. Endorphins are similar to enkephalins, but they are more potent and they have a longer lasting effect. If you are a runner or an endurance athlete, I am sure you have heard the term endorphin high. And that's why you get it.